We're investigating how the solar wind influences the upper atmosphere of Venus. The goal of this research is to test the hypothesis that the superrotating zonal flow in the upper atmosphere is driven by a combination of the solar wind interaction and the planet's orbital motion. The takeaway points from this talk are that the ions and the neutrals are intimately coupled. For the first time, simulated nightside ionospheric structures match those observed by the planar Venus orbiter. The ionosphere and the neutral atmosphere affect one another, and the orbital speed of Venus, roughly 10% of the solar wind speed, may be an important driver of the upper atmosphere superrotation. To do this study, we're using the half-shell hybrid code. The hybrid code treats ions as kinetic particles and electrons as a fluid. We use multiple ion and neutral species within the code. The code contains a time-dependent ion-neutral photochemistry that we use to generate an ionosphere from a neutral atmosphere. The neutral atmosphere we use comes from the Venus thermosphere general circulation model, and we use two different results, one without the upper atmosphere superrotation and one with. And from the VTGCM, we take the neutral atmospheric densities and the winds and use them in the hybrid code. And then the code also contains several complex collisional models, so we can model energy and momentum transfer between the ions and the neutrals. So the rest of this talk will review what PBO saw. We will discuss the simulation results of the nightside ionospheric structures. We'll take a look at the effects of the neutral atmosphere on the solar wind interaction. We'll look at the effects the ions have on the neutral atmosphere, and then we'll wrap up with some conclusions. So Pioneer Venus Orbiter, or PBO, observed that solar wind came in and formed the bow shock in front of the planet. That plasma was lost down the night side, and during this plasma loss, several structures were created, tail rays and filaments, and then there were plasma holes. And these structures have yet to, before now, to be reproduced within any simulation of Venus. These structures extended between 50 and 65 degrees latitude in the northern hemisphere and between 20 and 35 degrees in the southern hemisphere. In the plasma holes, typically the electron density dropped down to about 10 per centimeter cubed, which was several orders of magnitude lower than the adjacent regions. The holes were not detected down below 200 kilometers. The latitudinal size of any individual hole ranged between 6 to 1800 kilometers, or roughly 5 to 16 degrees. And the magnetic field in the holes was vertical and enhanced by 10 to 40 nanotesla compared to the surrounding regions. So here are the simulation results. On the left, you see a cut through the equatorial plane. And on the right, you see a cut along the white line on the left. And if you look at the plasma in the tail, in the night side region, you see streamers and holes, qualitatively resembling the PBO picture very well, except that it's offset from the noon midnight line. It's more aligned with the IMF direction. Well, when you take the PBO data and put it in the convection electric field frame, you see that the PBO, when PBO observed these structures, they too are offset to one, with a preference to one hemisphere over the other. And the location of where PBO saw these structures is dependent on the IMF direction. So if we compare our tail structures to qualitatively with PBO, you'll see that the latitudinal extent's about the same. They're in the right quadrant. The densities in the holes and the surrounding structures are in agreement. The holes go all the way down to about 250, 200 kilometers altitude, and the hole size is about right. So if you notice with the figure in the figure, the blue cyan border is around 250 kilometers. And as we revolve around the structures, you see that they extend about the same latitude and longitudinal extent as discussed before. And as we look down upon the structures, you can see that the holes actually go all the way down to the ionosphere. So again, we're a good qualitative agreement with PVO's results. If we look at the magnetic field, we see that where there are density holes, we have a buildup in the magnetic field strength. It's about, in this case, about 30 nanotesla over. Again, in agreement with the PVO data. So what we've learned is these structures, the formation is controlled by the grad PE term, or the ambipolar electric field. If you remove this term, the structures do not form. Where they form is dependent on the IMF direction. And if we change the IMF direction, we can actually get them to form in the opposite quadrant. And so the condition for these structures to form is that the ambipolar electric field must act parallel or along the local magnetic field. And when these conditions are met, the structures form. Okay, well, we tried two different two different atmospheric winds just to see if they make a difference. How important is it to include the superrotation of the upper atmosphere into the simulations? On the left-hand side, we see the simulation results for the magnetic field using the VT-GCM atmosphere without the superrotation. And on the right, we see the same results for using the VT-GCM with superrotation. If you look at the shock shape in the red boxes, you'll see they're different. There are also differences in the magnetic barrier in the white box, though they're a little more subtle. So the choice of neutral atmospheres, the winds in particular, make a difference. And the question is why? Well, the gradients in the ion densities being collisionally coupled to the neutral winds create currents, and these current systems can create magnetic fields. And in the case without the superrotation on the left, you see that the magnetic fields are symmetric about the noon midnight line, where with the superrotation, they're offset and stronger. So when measuring magnetic fields at Venus to determine if there are crustal fields or a large-scale dynamo, one should consider magnetic fields generated by the atmosphere. Ions also affect the neutral atmosphere via transport. So you can start with a neutral CO2. It becomes ionized. It then it gets moved by electric and magnetic fields to another location in the ionosphere where it can interact with the neutrals there. And in the process, it changes the local neutral density and ion density. So this is just a transport mechanism, not currently in most neutral models, but is worth considering. Ions can also exchange energy with the neutral atmosphere via collisions. And on the right, you see a volumetric rendering of the energy deposition around Venus. At noon is at 0 and 360. We see on the day side, there's a lot of energy being transferred at higher altitudes. On the night side, it's below 200 kilometers altitude. On the left, we see slices at various altitudes through this volume rendering. And again, at 160, most of the energy is deposited on the day side. It gets interesting at 135 kilometers, where all of a sudden we get this new energy source being deposited on the night side. And then even at 110 kilometers, which is well below the ionospheric peak, we still have ions depositing energy. So if we look at, well, what is creating that night side bulge, or that night side energy deposition, we see that's the solar wind protons. They deposit most of their energy between 135 and 140 kilometers with a peak at around 220 degrees. But most of the heating is of the upper atmosphere above 140 degrees, or sorry, above 140 kilometers. For comparison, the O2 plus deposits most of its energy on the day side. Again, most of the heating is above 150 kilometers. So the question is, what does this energy being transferred from the ions to the neutrals do to the atmosphere? So how much ion heating goes to the atmosphere? On the left, you see the heating, the neutral temperature from the VT-GCM without ion heating. There's a maximum noon temperature of about 240 degrees Kelvin and a minimum temperature of about 100 Kelvin at midnight. When you add the ion heating, the day temperature ranges between 270 and 285 degrees Kelvin, so a significant increase over the previous results. And the night side temperature goes from 100 to 130 degrees Kelvin. So the ions are giving a substantial amount of heat to the atmosphere, and that will change the atmospheric dynamics. Okay, so some food for thought. The old picture was that the major energy source into the upper atmosphere was solar EUV, and that was driving the dynamics. The new picture shows that solar wind particles and other ions can asymmetrically add energy to the upper atmosphere. And it's not an insignificant amount. In the future, this leads credibility to the postulate that if you add the orbital motion, you're going to further enhance the asymmetric energy deposition in the upper atmosphere and potentially drive the superrotation of the upper atmosphere. So in conclusions, the simulations for the first time reproduced night-side ionospheric structures reported by PVO. The atmosphere and the ionosphere are coupled in a variety of ways via photochemistry, ion transport, and chemistry. Ion neutral collisions couple them via energy and momentum. Electric and magnetic fields are coupled in part by this atmospheric dynamo and particle energy deposition. So because of this, the plasma interaction extends from the bow shock down through the atmosphere and from the atmosphere up through the bow shock. To understand the interaction, you really need to understand all those pieces. Asymmetric energy deposition supports the hypothesis that the super-rotating upper atmosphere is driven by the combination of the plasma interaction and the orbital motion. And so our next step is to add the orbital motion of Venus. Thank you.